If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The glass tower stood silent against the Chicago skyline, its windows reflecting the last traces of sunset like fragments of amber. On the 42nd floor, where the executive suite stretched in elegant emptiness, only the emergency lights remained, casting long shadows across marble floors and leather chairs that cost more than most people earned in a month. It was past 9 in the evening, and Emily Carter was still there, fingers flying across her keyboard, eyes burning. From staring at screens for 12 hours straight. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her shift ended at 6, like always, but Mr. Harrison's calendar was a disaster. 3 meetings had been double booked for tomorrow, and someone needed to fix it before the CEO walked into his office and found chaos waiting. That someone, as usual, was her. Emily didn't mind, not really. The overtime meant an extra $70, maybe $80 if she stayed past 10. Every dollar mattered when you were raising a teenage brother on a secretary's salary in one of the most expensive cities in America. Back in their small apartment in Pilsen, 16-year-old Danny was probably using his inhaler right now, struggling through another asthma attack triggered by the cold November air that seeped through their poorly insulated windows. The thought made Emily's chest tighten. The medication was expensive, even with insurance. The good inhaler, the one that actually worked, wasn't covered. They made do with the cheaper version and hoped for the best. She stretched her neck, hearing it crack, and glanced around the empty floor. The cleaning crew had already passed through. The security guard had made his rounds an hour ago. She was alone with the hum of computers and the faint whistle of wind against reinforced glass. In the corner office, Mr. Harrison's door stood half open, his desk lamp still on from when he'd rushed out earlier to catch a flight to New York. That's when the phone rang, not the regular office line that lit up on her desk console. This was different. The sound came from inside Mr. Harrison's office, from the private line that almost nobody had access to. Emily froze, her hands hovering over her keyboard. She knew that phone. It was for board members, major investors, people whose names appeared in Forbes and Wall Street Journal. Mr. Harrison had made it very clear more than once that his private line was off limits. Under no circumstances should anyone answer it. The ringing continued, insistent, urgent. Emily bit her lip, torn between following the rules and the nagging feeling that ignoring this call might be worse than breaking protocol. What if it was an emergency? What if someone needed to reach Mr. Harrison immediately? She glanced at the clock. He was probably still in the air, phone switched off, unreachable. The phone rang again, and again. Emily stood, up slowly, her heart pounding. She walked toward the corner office, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ringing seemed to grow louder, more demanding. She reached the doorway, hesitated, then crossed the threshold into the CEO's domain. The desk was immaculate, everything in its place. The leather chair pushed back exactly 3 inches from the edge, and there, on the polished surface, the private phone blazed with incoming light. She picked it up. Her hand was shaking as she brought it to her ear. For a moment she couldn't speak, her throat dry, her mind screaming that she'd just made a terrible mistake. Then a voice came through, deep and accented, speaking English with the precise formality of someone who'd learned it in expensive international schools. The man didn't introduce himself right away. He simply asked, with barely controlled anger, if this was Alexander Harrison's office. Emily managed to confirm that it was, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained, stumbling over her words, that Mr. Harrison wasn't available, that she was his administrative assistant, that she could take a message. There was a pause, cold and heavy. Then the man spoke again, and this time Emily heard something dangerous in his tone. He identified himself as Khalid al-Mansour, and even someone like Emily, who didn't follow business news closely, recognized that name. He was the investor, the one from Qatar, the man whose partnership had been celebrated in every major newspaper 3 months ago, whose deal with Harrison's company was supposed to transform them from a regional player into a global powerhouse. And he was furious. Mr. Al-Mansour's words came fast and sharp. He'd been trying to reach Harrison for hours. He'd discovered something in the final contract, a clause that hadn't been there in the versions he'd reviewed and approved, an exclusivity provision, buried in legal language that essentially locked him into terms he'd never agreed to. Someone had altered the contract without his knowledge, and he wanted answers immediately. If he didn't get them, if he didn't get a satisfactory explanation and correction by tomorrow morning, the entire deal was off. All of it. The $200 million investment, the international expansion, the jobs that depended on it. Everything. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She looked down at Mr. Harrison's desk and saw it. A thick folder marked confidential. The Al Mansour contract with yellow highlights and red annotations scattered across the pages. She'd seen Harrison reviewing it earlier, his expression troubled, making notes in the margins. She took a deep breath and made a decision that terrified her. Instead of simply promising to pass along the message, she asked Mr. Al Mansour if he could wait. Not hang up, just hold for a moment. He agreed, suspicion clear in his silence. With trembling hands, Emily opened the folder and found the section he was talking about. There it was, paragraph 14, subsection C, a clause about exclusive partnership rights that looked different from the surrounding text, as if it had been added recently. She'd heard things, whispers in the break room, fragments of conversation between junior executives who thought the support staff didn't matter enough to lower their voices around. Talk about pushing the client, about inserting terms he wouldn't dare refuse once everything else was signed. At the time, she'd thought it was just corporate bravado, the kind of thing ambitious men said to sound important. Now, holding this contract, she realized it had been real. Emily returned to the phone and did something that could cost her everything. She told Mr. Al Mansour the truth. She admitted she was just an assistant, that she had no authority, no legal training, no right to even be looking at this document. But she also told him that she could see the clause he was talking about, that it did look unusual, that she believed him when he said it shouldn't be there. And she made a promise. If he could wait until morning, she would personally make sure Mr. Harrison knew about this the moment he arrived. She would do everything in her power to get him a real answer, an honest one. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Mr. Al Mansour spoke, his voice still hard but slightly less hostile. He gave her until 9 o'clock the next morning, Chicago time. If he didn't hear from Harrison by then, with a concrete plan to fix this, he was walking away. The conversation ended with a click that echoed in the empty office like a gunshot. Emily stood there, the phone still in her hand, suddenly aware of what she'd just done. She'd inserted herself into a situation far above her position. She'd made promises she had no authority to make. She'd accessed documents she probably shouldn't have touched. And now, the future of her company and possibly her own job depended on what happened in the next 12 hours. Outside the windows, Chicago glittered with a million lights, indifferent to the small human drama playing out on the 42nd floor. Emily carefully placed the phone back in its cradle, closed the contract folder, and sat down in Mr. Harrison's chair to wait for dawn. Emily didn't sleep. She couldn't. After the call ended, she'd sat in the darkness of the executive floor, replaying every word, every inflection in Khalid Al Mansour's voice, trying to figure out if she'd just saved something or destroyed everything. Around midnight, she'd finally left the building, caught the last train home to Pilsen, and found Danny asleep on the couch, his inhaler on the coffee table next to an empty cup of tea. She'd covered him with a blanket, kissed his forehead, and lay awake in her own bed, watching the ceiling and counting down the hours. By 6 in the morning, she was back. The city was still dark, the loop quiet except for early delivery trucks and street sweepers. Emily used her keycard to access the building, nodded at the night security guard who looked surprised to see her so early, and rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor with her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd rehearsed what she would say to Mr. Harrison at least 100 times during the sleepless night. Each version sounded worse than the last. The executive suite was empty when she arrived. She made coffee in the small kitchen, her hands steadier now that she had something to do. She organized her desk, checked emails, printed out the day's schedule, normal things, familiar routines, anything to keep from thinking about what was coming. At 7:45, she heard the elevator doors open and recognized the footsteps immediately. Alexander Harrison walked fast, always had, his Italian leather shoes striking the marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd never had to ask permission for anything. Emily stood up from her desk, smoothing down her skirt. She'd worn her best outfit, a navy blue dress that Danny had helped her pick out last year, the one she saved for important meetings. Harrison barely glanced at her as he approached, his attention focused on his phone, scrolling through messages. With the distracted frown of a man who'd already fought 3 battles before breakfast, she stepped into his path, and he almost walked into her. He looked up, startled, seeing her properly for the first time. Emily took a breath and spoke before her courage could fail her. She said his name, formal and careful, and asked if she could speak with him urgently. Something in her tone must have registered, because he stopped, really stopped, and looked at her with those sharp grey eyes that had intimidated her since her first day on the job. They went into his office. Emily closed the door behind them, something she'd never done before. Harrison set down his briefcase, loosened his tie slightly, and waited. She told him everything. The phone call, the investor from Qatar, the clause, the deadline that was now less than an hour away. She explained that she knew she shouldn't have answered his private line, that she'd overstepped badly, that she was prepared to accept whatever consequences came from that. But she also said, with more force than she knew she possessed, that Mr. Al-Mansour deserved to know what had happened, and that someone needed to tell him the truth before it was too late. Alexander Harrison's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion. Then, when she mentioned the altered clause, something darker. He asked her to repeat the details, his voice tight. He pulled up the contract on his computer, scrolling to the section she'd described, his jaw clenched as he read. Emily watched him, trying to gauge whether she was about to be fired or thanked, possibly both. Harrison picked up his desk phone and called his legal team, waking up the senior counsel at home. The conversation was brief and tense. When he hung up, he looked at Emily and said something she hadn't expected. He thanked her. Not effusively, not emotionally, but with genuine weight behind the words. If she hadn't answered that call, if Al-Mansour had hung up and made his decision in anger, the company would have lost everything without even knowing why. The clause had been inserted after Harrison's final approval, slipped into the document during what should have been routine formatting. Someone on the inside had altered a $200 million contract without authorization, betting that a wealthy foreign investor wouldn't read the fine print carefully enough to notice. It was fraud. It was also incredibly stupid, the kind of arrogance that assumed everyone else was either too trusting or too ignorant to fight back. Harrison spent the next 30 minutes on the phone with Khalid Al-Mansour, and Emily, standing awkwardly by the door, heard only his side of the conversation. But she heard enough: the apology, the acknowledgement of the unauthorized change, the promise of complete transparency and immediate correction, the request for a chance to meet in person and review everything together. When Harrison finally hung up, he looked exhausted, but relieved. Al-Mansour had agreed to fly to Chicago within the week to personally oversee the contract revision. The deal was still alive. Barely. Word spread through the office like wildfire. By 9:30, everyone on the executive floor knew that something major had happened. By 10, the story had reached the lower floors, growing and changing with each retelling. The secretary who saved the company, the overnight crisis, the mysterious investor from the Middle East. Emily became the center of attention in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. Some colleagues congratulated her, others looked at her with barely concealed resentment. The worst was Linda Morrison, a junior analyst who'd been angling for a promotion to Harrison's direct team for months. She cornered Emily in the break room that afternoon, her smile sharp as broken glass. She made a comment, seemingly casual, about how lucky Emily was to have such a close relationship with the CEO. How interesting it was that a simple secretary would be trusted with such sensitive information. How some people seemed to advance through means that had nothing to do with their actual qualifications. The implication hung in the air like poison. Emily felt her face burn, but she said nothing. What could she say? That she'd just answered a phone. That she'd done what any decent person would do. Linda wouldn't believe it, and neither would anyone else who wanted a reason to diminish what had happened. If you were in Emily's place, would you have answered that phone call or would you have let it ring? Tell us in the comments. At home that night, Danny was having another bad day. Emily found him in their tiny kitchen, hunched over the table, his breathing labored and wheezy. She helped him with his inhaler, rubbed his back until the tightness eased and made him soup, even though he said he wasn't hungry. He asked about her day and she told him it was fine, just busy. She didn't mention the contract or the investor or the fact that her name was now being whispered in hallways by people who either admired her or despised her. Danny looked at her with eyes too old for 16 and asked if she was okay. Emily smiled and lied and said of course she was. Later, after he'd gone to bed, she sat in the dark living room and let herself feel the weight of everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the strange, unsettling realization that her life had changed in ways she didn't fully understand yet. Back at the office, Alexander Harrison was having his own reckoning. He sat in his home office in his townhouse in Lincoln Park, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk, thinking about the woman who worked 15 feet from his door every day and whom he'd barely noticed until she'd saved him from a catastrophe of his own company's making. He thought about her voice on the phone, steady despite obvious fear. He thought about the way she'd stood in his office that morning, shoulders straight, admitting fault, while also refusing to apologize for doing the right thing. Something had shifted. He couldn't quite name it, didn't want to examine it too closely, but Alexander Harrison, who prided himself on reading people and situations with ruthless accuracy, knew that Emily Carter was no longer just another face in the administrative pool. She was someone who mattered. And that recognition, he was beginning to realize, carried complications he hadn't anticipated. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. The legal team worked around the clock to audit every document, every communication, trying to trace exactly how the contract had been altered and by whom. Harrison personally reviewed the security logs, the access records, the digital fingerprints left behind by whoever had made the change. Emily watched from the sidelines, trying to do her regular work while feeling the weight of dozens of eyes tracking her every movement. And then came the discovery that changed everything. The IT department flagged an anomaly in the system logs. The unauthorized modifications to the Al Mansour contract had been made using Emily's login credentials. Her digital signature appeared on documents she swore she'd never touched, at times when she claimed to have been nowhere near her computer. According to the official record, Emily Carter was responsible for the fraudulent alterations that had nearly destroyed the biggest deal in company history. The news reached Harrison's desk late on Thursday afternoon. He stared at the report, his expression unreadable. Then he called Emily into his office and closed the door behind her, and she knew from the look on his face that whatever fragile piece they'd found was about to be tested in ways neither of them was ready for. Emily stood in Alexander Harrison's office, her legs barely supporting her weight, staring at the printed report he'd just handed her. The words blurred together, but certain phrases jumped out with horrible clarity. User ID, E. Carter. Timestamp, November 3rd, 11:47 p.m. Document modified, Al Mansour contract, final.docx, unauthorized access, security breach, her name, her credentials, her responsibility. Except she'd never done any of it. Her hands were shaking so badly the papers rustled. She looked up at Harrison, searching his face for some sign of what he believed, but his expression was carefully neutral. Professional. The mask he wore in boardrooms when negotiations turned dangerous. She tried to speak, but her throat had closed up. Finally, she managed to whisper that it wasn't her, that she'd never accessed those files, that someone must have stolen her login information. Harrison's voice was quiet when he responded. He said he wanted to believe her, and she heard the emphasis on the word wanted, the implication that belief required more than just her word against digital evidence. He explained that the company's cybersecurity protocols were sophisticated, that using someone else's credentials required either their password or serious hacking skills. He asked gently but firmly if she'd shared her login with anyone, if she'd written it down somewhere, if her computer had been left unlocked. Emily felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She explained that she was always careful with passwords, that she followed every security protocol, that the only time her computer was unattended was during lunch breaks and after hours when the floor was supposedly secure. Even as she said it, she realized how weak it sounded. How many opportunities had there been? How many moments when someone with the right skills and the wrong intentions could have accessed her workstation? Harrison made a decision. He told her that he was ordering a full forensic audit of the security systems, that he'd bring in external specialists if necessary, and that until they had answers, she was not to discuss this with anyone. Not colleagues, not friends, not even her brother. The investigation needed to remain confidential. He also said, with a firmness that felt almost protective, that she wasn't being suspended or fired. Not yet. He wanted the truth, whatever it was, and he wasn't going to sacrifice her to appearances before he had it. The relief Emily felt was almost painful. She thanked him, her voice breaking, and left his office trying to maintain some dignity. But the moment she reached her desk, the reality of her situation crashed over her. Someone had deliberately framed her. Someone had used her identity to commit fraud, knowing that a young secretary with no power and no connections would make a perfect scapegoat. And whoever it was, they were still out there, watching, waiting to see if their plan would work. Over the next 2 days, Emily became hyper-aware of everything around her. She noticed the way certain people looked at her, the conversations that stopped when she approached, the subtle shift in how she was treated. Linda Morrison's fake sympathy felt like acid. The cleaning lady, Maria, an older woman who'd always been kind, pulled Emily aside and warned her to be careful, that powerful people didn't like being embarrassed, and that someone was going to pay for the contract mess. Emily didn't know if it was meant as comfort or threat. The person she watched most carefully was Jeffrey Chen, a senior analyst who'd been with the company for 5 years and had a reputation for brilliance and ruthless ambition. He'd grown up in Manhattan, gone to Columbia, spoke 3 languages, and made it clear he considered himself destined for the executive suite. Emily had always found him intimidating, the way he could make you feel invisible with a single dismissive glance. Since the Al-Mansour crisis began, Jeffrey had been particularly vocal in meetings, questioning why a secretary had been involved in high-level decisions, suggesting that perhaps security protocols needed to be tightened to prevent administrative staff from accessing sensitive information. On Friday afternoon, Emily was restocking supplies in the copy room when she heard voices in the hallway outside. She recognized Jeffrey's distinctive accent, that particular blend of educated American with hints of his parents' Beijing origins. He was talking to someone from legal, and their conversation made Emily's blood run cold. Jeffrey was discussing the contract modification, speaking in the low, confident tone of someone who thought he was among allies. He mentioned how convenient it was that the digital trail led to someone so obviously out of her depth, how the investigation would probably conclude that she'd been trying to help and had accidentally caused the problem. The other voice, which Emily didn't recognize, laughed and said something about knowing when to use the right tools for the job. Jeffrey's response was chilling. He said that sometimes you had to create opportunities for people to reveal their limitations, that the company would be better off when everyone stuck to their appropriate level. Emily's heart was pounding so hard she thought they must hear it. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, as the voices moved away down the corridor. When she was sure they were gone, she leaned against the copy machine, her mind racing. Jeffrey had done it. He'd altered the contract, used her credentials to cover his tracks, and was now positioning himself to benefit from the chaos he'd created. But knowing it and proving it were 2 completely different things. She thought about going to Harrison immediately, telling him what she'd overheard. But would he believe her? A secretary's word against a senior analyst's? Jeffrey would deny everything, say she was desperate and making accusations to save herself. She needed proof, something concrete that even he couldn't talk his way around. That night, Emily did something she'd never imagined herself capable of. She stayed late again, but this time with a purpose. She waited until the floor was empty, until even the security guards had made their rounds, and then she accessed the server logs from her computer. She wasn't supposed to have permission for that level of system access, But months ago, when the IT department had been short-staffed, they'd temporarily elevated her credentials to help with a data migration project. No one had ever revoked those permissions. Emily wasn't a hacker, but she'd learned enough from her ex-boyfriend, who'd worked in IT before they broke up, to navigate basic directory structures. She searched for access logs from November 3rd, the night. The contract was supposedly modified using her credentials. What she found made her hands shake. Her login had been used, yes, but from a workstation on the 44th floor in the analytics department, Jeffrey's floor, and the IP address matched a computer assigned to him. She copied the files to a USB drive, her heart hammering, knowing that what she was doing could get her fired, even if she was right. But she also knew it might be the only way to prove her innocence. She was just about to log out when she heard the elevator ding. Someone was coming. Emily grabbed the USB drive, shoved it into her purse, and tried to look casual as she pulled up a spreadsheet on her screen. Jeffrey Chen walked onto the floor, and when he saw her, he stopped. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he smiled, that same dismissive expression she'd seen 100 times, and asked what she was doing there so late. Emily, forcing her voice to stay steady, said she was catching up on work. He nodded slowly, his eyes moving to her computer screen, then back to her face. He told her she should be careful working alone at night, that the building could be dangerous after hours, that you never knew what might happen. The threat was clear, even if the words were superficially polite. Emily met his gaze and said she'd be fine, that she was almost done anyway. Jeffrey lingered for a moment longer as if deciding something, then wished her a good night and walked to his own office. Emily waited exactly 3 minutes, then shut down her computer, grabbed her things, and practically ran to the elevator. On the train home, clutching her purse with the USB drive inside, Emily realized she'd crossed a line. She'd found evidence, but she'd also put herself in Jeffrey's sights. He knew she suspected something, and if he was willing to frame her for fraud, what else might he be capable of? When she got home, Danny was asleep again, his breathing easier tonight, thank God. Emily sat at their tiny kitchen table, the USB drive in front of her, and tried to decide what to do. She could give it to Harrison on Monday, lay out everything she'd found and hope he believed her. Or she could wait, gather more evidence, make absolutely sure before she made an accusation that could end her career and maybe put her in actual danger. The decision was made for her the next morning when she received an email from Human Resources. Effective immediately, she was being placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of the security investigation. The message was formal, impersonal, the kind of corporate language that meant her fate was being decided in rooms she'd never enter by people who saw her as a problem to be managed, not a person to be protected. Emily stared at the email, feeling something inside her harden. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated, being told that people like her should be grateful for whatever scraps they were given. She'd accepted it because she'd had no choice, because fighting back seemed impossible when you were just trying to survive. But this was different. This was someone actively trying to destroy her, and she wasn't going to let it happen. She picked up her phone and called Alexander Harrison's personal cell number, the one he'd given her during the Al Mansour crisis. When he answered, she could hear surprise in his voice. She asked if they could meet somewhere outside the office, somewhere private. She said she had information about the security breach, evidence he needed to see before Monday. There was a pause. Then he gave her an address. A coffee shop in Wicker Park, neutral territory, away from company eyes. Emily arrived first, chose a corner table, and waited. When Harrison walked in 20 minutes later, dressed in weekend casual that probably cost more than her monthly rent, she saw him properly for the first time as something other than her boss. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 40, with grey already, threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and difficult decisions. He looked tired. He looked, she realized, almost as scared as she felt. They sat down, and Emily pulled out the USB drive. She told him everything. The conversation she'd overheard, the server logs she'd found, the IP address that traced back to Jeffrey Chen's workstation. She watched his face change as he listened, saw anger replace confusion, then something calculating and cold that reminded her he hadn't built a successful company by being soft. Harrison took the USB drive and asked her a question that cut right through her defenses. He asked if she understood what she was risking by bringing this to him, what Jeffrey would do if he found out, what it meant to go up against someone with connections and resources far beyond hers. Emily looked at him steadily and said yes, she understood. She also understood that sometimes you had to stand up even when the odds were against you, because the alternative was letting people like Jeffrey win. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond the professional relationship they'd maintained. Harrison reached across the table and covered her hand with his, just for a second, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of it. He promised her that he'd handle this, that she wouldn't face it alone. And Emily, who'd learned not to trust promises from powerful men, found herself believing him anyway. The week that followed felt like walking through a minefield, blindfolded. Emily remained on administrative leave, technically not allowed in the building, while Harrison worked behind the scenes with the forensic IT team he'd brought in from outside the company. She spent her days at home with Danny, helping him with homework and pretending everything was normal, while her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues asking what was happening, if the rumors were true, if she was coming back. Linda Morrison sent her a text dripping with false concern, saying how sorry she was that Emily was going through such a difficult time, how everyone was talking about the investigation, how hard it must be to have your integrity questioned. Emily deleted it without responding. Maria, the cleaning lady, called her directly and told her to be strong, that she'd seen things over. The years working in that building, that the people at the top always protected their own, but sometimes, very rarely, justice actually happened. On Wednesday, Harrison called her. His voice was tight with controlled anger. The forensic audit had confirmed everything. Jeffrey Chen had accessed the contract system using sophisticated credential spoofing software, modified the Al Mansour agreement to include the exclusivity clause, and deliberately left a trail pointing to Emily's user ID. The motive was exactly what she'd suspected. Jeffrey had been positioning himself for a promotion to Vice President of International Operations, the role that would oversee the Al Mansour partnership. By creating a crisis and then appearing to help solve it, he'd planned to demonstrate his value and eliminate potential competition, including anyone who might question his methods. What Jeffrey hadn't counted on was Emily answering that phone call. Her intervention had saved the deal but also exposed the fraud before it could be buried. Now he was scrambling, trying to salvage his position by doubling down on the narrative that she was the problem, that a secretary shouldn't have had access to sensitive information in the first place, that the real issue was lax security protocols rather than his deliberate sabotage. Harrison told Emily to prepare herself for what was coming next. Khalid Al-Mansour was arriving in Chicago on Friday, 2 days away. The meeting would include not just the contract review, but a full presentation of what had happened, how it had been discovered, and what steps the company was taking to ensure it never happened again. Harrison wanted Emily there, not hiding in the background, but present, visible, ready to tell her side of the story if Al-Mansour asked. It was risky putting her in the same room with the investor whose deal had almost been destroyed, with Jeffrey who'd tried to destroy her, with executives who still weren't sure whether to see her as a hero or a liability. But Harrison said he trusted her, and he needed Al-Mansour to see who had actually saved his partnership and who had tried to profit from betraying it. Emily agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. She'd come this far. She wasn't going to back down now. Friday morning arrived cold and grey, typical November weather in Chicago, with wind whipping off Lake Michigan and cutting through even the warmest coat. Emily dressed carefully, the same navy blue, dress she'd worn on the morning she'd confessed to Harrison about the phone call, her hair pulled back, minimal makeup. She wanted to look professional, but not like she was trying too hard. Danny hugged her before she left, told her she was braver than anyone he knew, and she carried those words with her like armor. The building lobby had been transformed, security had been doubled, plants brought in to make the space look more welcoming, every surface polished to reflection. Emily signed in at the visitor desk even though she'd worked there for 3 years, her administrative leave, status meaning she technically no longer had building access. The security guard, Tom, who'd always been kind to her, gave her an encouraging nod as he handed her a temporary badge. On the 42nd floor, the tension was palpable. Executives moved through the hallways with forced calm, assistants checked and rechecked conference room setups, and somewhere someone was having a low, urgent conversation about presentation slides. Emily was directed to wait in a small office near the main conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see people gathering, recognizing faces from the legal team, from finance, from international operations. And then she saw Jeffrey. He walked past without looking at her, his expression confident, almost amused. He was wearing his most expensive suit, the one he saved for important clients, and he moved with the easy assurance of someone who believed he'd already won. Emily felt a flash of cold fury. He'd tried to ruin her life to advance his career, and he still thought he'd get away with it. At exactly 10 o'clock, Alexander Harrison appeared at her door. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, but his eyes were clear and determined. He asked if she was ready, and when she nodded, he led her toward the conference room. The moment she walked in, every conversation stopped. 15 people turned to look at her, and Emily forced herself to walk steadily to the chair Harrison indicated, at the table, rather than along the wall where support staff usually sat. Khalid Al-Mansour arrived 10 minutes later, and Emily recognized him immediately from news photos, though in person he was somehow both more imposing and more human. He was tall, maybe in his early 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of presence that came from a lifetime of commanding rooms full of powerful people. His suit was immaculate, probably custom-made in London, and he was accompanied by 3 advisors who radiated efficiency and sharp intelligence. Harrison made introductions, his voice formal and respectful. When he got to Emily, he didn't call her his secretary or his assistant. He introduced her as Emily Carter, the person who had first alerted him to the contract discrepancy and whose diligence had prevented a catastrophic breakdown in their partnership. Al-Mansour's dark eyes fixed on her, and she felt evaluated in a way that made her want to sit up straighter. Then Al-Mansour did something unexpected. He spoke directly to her in that same accented English she'd heard on the phone and thanked her by name. He said that in his experience, the most valuable people in any organization were often the ones everyone else overlooked, the individuals who did their jobs with integrity, whether anyone was watching or not. He'd built his fortune by recognizing talent wherever it appeared, and he recognized it in her decision to answer his call that night instead of letting it ring. Emily felt her face flush, but she met his eyes and thanked him quietly. She could see in her peripheral vision Jeffrey's expression tightening, Linda Morrison looking like she'd swallowed glass, and several executives reassessing their assumptions in real time. The meeting began. Harrison laid out the timeline of events with clinical precision, from the initial contract approval through the unauthorized modifications, the discovery of the fraud, and the forensic investigation. He displayed the server logs, the IP addresses, the timeline that made it impossible to deny what had happened, and then he identified Jeffrey Chen as the person responsible, presenting evidence so comprehensive that there was no room for doubt or spin. Jeffrey tried to defend himself. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that he'd been trying to strengthen the company's position, that his intentions had been pure even if his methods were unconventional. His voice had that smooth, educated confidence that had always intimidated Emily before, but now she could hear the desperation underneath it. He was good, she had to admit. If she hadn't been there, if she hadn't heard him in the hallway, if she hadn't found that evidence, he might have talked his way around it. But Al-Mansour had no patience for it. He cut Jeffrey off mid-sentence and asked a simple question. If his intentions were pure, why had he attempted to frame an innocent employee? Why had he deliberately left a trail pointing to someone with no access to the systems, no motive to commit fraud, and no ability to defend herself against accusations from someone at his level? Jeffrey had no good answer. He stammered something about security protocols and regrettable oversights, and Al-Mansour's expression went cold. He turned to Harrison and said in a voice that carried absolute authority that he would not do business with a company that tolerated this kind of behavior. Not the contract modification, though that was serious enough, but the willingness to sacrifice an innocent person to protect a guilty one. If Harrison wanted to maintain their partnership, He needed to demonstrate right now what kind of organization he was running. The room went silent. Emily could hear her own heartbeat, could see Harrison's jaw set in that way it did when he was making a decision that would have consequences he couldn't take back. He looked at Jeffrey, and there was no warmth in his eyes, none of the collegiality that usually existed between executives. He said clearly and without hesitation that Jeffrey Chen's employment was terminated effective immediately, that he would be escorted from the building within the hour, and that the company would be pursuing all available legal remedies for the damage he'd caused. Jeffrey's face went white. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, to deploy whatever charm or threat he thought might change the outcome. But Harrison had already moved on, was already asking security to come in, was already making it clear that the conversation was over. Emily watched Jeffrey being led out, saw the exact moment. His confidence cracked, and real fear showed through and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a kind of tired relief that it was finally over. After Jeffrey was gone, Al-Mansour turned his attention back to the contract. The rest of the meeting proceeded with unexpected smoothness. The exclusivity clause was removed, additional transparency measures were added, and by noon, they'd signed a revised agreement that both sides could support. Before he left, Al-Mansour shook Harrison's hand and told him he'd made the right decision. Then he turned to Emily and said something she would never forget. He told her that courage came in many forms, and that answering a phone when you weren't supposed to, telling the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, those were acts of courage that mattered more than any business deal. When the conference room finally emptied, when the lawyers had packed up their documents and the executives had scattered back to their offices, Emily found herself alone with Harrison. He closed the door, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from her like they were equals rather than boss and employee. He told her that her administrative leave was over, that she was welcome back effective immediately. But then he said something else. He said that if she wanted, there was a position opening in his office, not as a secretary, but as a special assistant, someone who worked directly with him on sensitive matters, someone whose judgment he'd come to trust more than people, with twice the education and 10 times the arrogance. The pay would be substantially better, the work would be challenging. And yes, there would be people who resented her for it, who would say she didn't deserve it, who would make the same ugly. Insinuations Linda Morrison had been spreading. Emily sat there processing what he was offering, a real career, a chance to be something more than the person who scheduled meetings and ordered supplies, but also more scrutiny, more pressure, more people watching and waiting for her to fail. She thought about Danny at home, about the medical bills that never stopped coming, about the future she'd always assumed was out of reach for people like her. She thought about that night in the empty office, picking up a phone that wasn't meant for her, making a choice that had changed everything. She looked at Alexander Harrison and saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. It wasn't just professional respect. It was something warmer, more personal, more complicated. He was offering her a job, yes, but he was also offering her a partnership, a place at his side, an acknowledgement that she mattered. And underneath all of that, barely visible but definitely there, was the beginning of something that could become dangerous if they let it. Emily took a breath and accepted. Not because she wasn't scared, but because she'd learned that sometimes the scariest choices were the ones that led somewhere worth going. They shook hands, formal and proper, but Harrison's grip lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and when he smiled at her, really smiled without the CEO mask, Emily felt something shift in her chest. Over the next months, as she settled into her new role, as she learned to navigate executive meetings and strategic planning sessions, as she discovered she had a gift for seeing through corporate doublespeak to the heart of what actually mattered, Emily and Harrison developed a working relationship that gradually became something more. It started with coffee before early meetings, continued through late-night strategy sessions, and deepened into conversations about life and loss and the strange isolation of being responsible for other people's futures. They were careful. They maintained professional boundaries in public, never gave anyone ammunition for accusations of impropriety. But alone in those moments when the masks came off, they found in each other something neither had expected. Harrison discovered that Emily challenged him in ways no one else dared, called him out when he was being arrogant or short-sighted, and brought a perspective shaped by struggle that made him a better leader. Emily discovered that underneath the CEO persona, Harrison was someone who'd built walls to protect himself from the loneliness of his position, someone who was tired of performing and grateful to be seen as simply human. Danny's health improved with better insurance and access to specialists Emily could finally afford. The apartment in Pilsen was replaced by a small house in a neighborhood with good schools. Emily's life transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. But she never forgot where she'd come from, never stopped being the person who understood what it meant to choose between medication and groceries, never lost the empathy that had made her pick up that phone in the first place. And late at night, when she and Harrison were alone in his office after everyone else had gone home, when they were just Emily and Alex rather than assistant and CEO, she would sometimes think back to that November evening when a ringing phone had offered her a choice: answer or ignore, step forward or stay safe, take a risk or protect yourself. She'd answered. And in doing so, she'd discovered that sometimes the smallest acts of courage opened doors you never knew existed, led you to people you never expected to matter, and transformed your life in ways that no amount of planning or ambition ever could. The story that began with a desperate investor from Qatar, a fraudulent contract, and a secretary who refused to be invisible had become something much more complex and beautiful, a testament to the truth that power and worth aren't always found where you expect them. Dear listeners, we hope Emily and Alexander's story touched your heart. If you were moved by their journey from that fateful phone call to finding courage and connection in unexpected places, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you most. Was it Emily's bravery in the face of injustice? The way she stood up for herself when everyone doubted her? Or perhaps the reminder that sometimes the people we overlook possess the greatest strength? Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.